Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you one or more photographs on the screen and it's your job to draw what you see. We'll have an artist joining us, doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow their advice or do your own thing. It is entirely up to you. Once the session is finished, don't forget to post your work onto Instagram and hashtag it with #RawUmberLive. You can also download the reference photographs and watch this video again after the session is finished. So if the artist is going too fast for you, don't worry. You can watch the video now and then watch it again later on. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this latest Raw Umber portrait session. In this 1 hour pose, I want to go back to basics and do a precise and structured portrait using just black pencil. The materials I'm using, as you can see, is white paper, quite smooth as well as a black pencil. I'm using Faber Castell here, Polychromos, but you can use any type of pencil or charcoal pencil that you prefer to use. To erase, I like to use a grey putty rubber. I believe it's also from Faber Castell, but any grey putty rubber will do. And finally, I like to use a range of blending tools. Sometimes I like to use a little synthetic brush. Other times I've recently gotten into the soft pastel knife. And it's basically a little makeup sponge on a plastic palette knife, which is really good for blending. Now on to the video. The first thing I want to talk about is how to hold your pencil. This may seem a little bit basic, but we're used to using the pencil like we would when we're writing, and this leaves quite a mark on the paper and allows you to use a bit too much pressure. So instead I'm using my whole arm and try to hold the pencil almost like a butter knife. And as you can see, this allows me to make much lighter marks, and also it allows me to make longer marks as well, because I'm not using my wrist, instead I'm using my whole arm. So I've just placed the top and the bottom of the portrait on the paper. And next I'm going to be putting in the center line, the line going for the middle of the forehead, all the way through the middle of the chin. Now I just want to note that I'm using comparative measurements here. And what this means is that if I'm, for instance, looking for the midpoint, I can lay my pencil across using my thumb and the top of the pencil to measure, to find the midpoint in both the picture as well as my drawing. Now in this case, we can see the midline is just above the corner of the eyes, maybe the top of the top lids. Now keep in mind that the head is at a slight angle, so I'm trying to reflect this with my lines. Another great advantage of comparative measurement is that we can compare lengths versus widths. For instance, if I look at that midpoint to the bottom of the chin, turn my pencil 90 degrees, and I can then find the middle of the center line to the edges of his hair. Now coming back to this midpoint, we know the brow should sit a little bit above it, so I'm just eyeballing where this should be. And this brings me to the next measurement. The 3/3 of the face, brow to bottom of the nose, should be equal to bottom of the nose to bottom of the chin. And these two are each 1/3. The final third is brow to top of the hairline or top of the forehead. And this should leave us with a little bit of extra space for the hair. Should be about the nose to the eye line in terms of length. Now this may all seem a little bit mechanical at first, all these big measurements, but I like to think of this stage as the scaffolding stage. Imagine we're building a house. At this point we're erecting all of the poles and putting down the foundations of the house. So using all my measurements, I now have the placement for most of the features as well as the width versus the height of the portrait. Now of course everyone has a slightly different face shape, and I like to think in terms of widths here. Jaw versus cheekbones, cheekbones versus forehead. And when I draw an imaginary horizontal line along the bottom of the nose, I can see that's where the jaw starts narrowing down towards the chin. And this might be different on each model, so it's always useful to look for these big angle breaks. Now on him I can see the cheekbones are the widest part of his face, and then we can see a narrowing down towards the forehead, which should be a little bit wider than a chin. For the top of the head I like to draw a circle going down towards the nose. This will be the top of the cranium or the top of the head, and allows a nice round top of the skull from which we can start sculpting the hair. So I've now drawn most of the measurements and the shape of his particular head. And at this point I want to spend a bit more time getting the scaffolding for the features. And there's quite a lot of measuring involved. For instance, when I'm looking at the brow, I can divide each half of the face into 4 equal parts. And the brow will sit somewhere in the middle there, arching up from the bridge of the nose, going across and then arching back down towards the top of the cheekbone. In the middle of the brow, you can think of 2 spheres that are the eyeballs. And you can also think of the brow as something that's arching over to protect the eyeball. So this means that almost always the brows and the eyeballs will be in shadow, or at least a darker mid-tone. So I'm just going to gently glaze this in using a little bit of pressure from my pencil. Now, apologies for the pencil being a little bit light. I have to keep light pressure at the start to make sure I can still erase my lines, but I will get darker as the video goes on. Now, taking the scaffolding approach to the nose, I can drop a vertical line from the inside of the eyeball down towards the line for the nose, and this should be the rough location of the nostrils. Halfway down the nose, we can see the tip of the nose starting. So we have the wedge shape of the bridge of the nose going down into the rounder shape of the tip of the nose. Now, underneath the tip of the nose starts turning down. This means that this part will be in shadow if the light is coming from the top, which it often is when we're looking at portraits. So this means I can gently shade in the bottom of the nose before moving on to the lips. For the lips, a last standardized measurement is to divide the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin into 3/3. The first line should be the line of the lips, the second line should be the start of the chin. For the corners of the mouth, just like for the corners of the nose, I like to drop a vertical line from the eye socket. Depending on how wide the mouth is, it could be in the center or closer to the inner corner. Now on him I can see his chin is a little bit taller, so I'm changing this measurement a little bit. And you can think of these measurements as guidelines and ways to see how the portrait deviates from these standards. And I find them a good starting point from which I can start adding more personal features. A bit like knowing the rules before you can break them. Now, just like I did for the other features, I use shading to indicate the features. Now the top lip is turning down, so that should be in the shadow, and the same for the bottom of the bottom lip. And I find this a really quick way to indicate the lips without having to do too much construction and drawing. So I've now shaded in his features, and before I move on to the next stage of the drawing, I want to shade in the rest that is in darks. So for instance, his hair is dark, as well as the bottom of the jawline and the neck. Now for this, I want to create a nice flat tone, and you can use, and I recommend using the pencil for this, but it can take a little bit of time. So I'm doing a little cheat here. I'm using some widow charcoal in a moment, but this does leave a bit of texture that you do then have to battle with. So it depends on what your preferences are. You can either go for something quicker that leaves some texture, or go in with the pencil and leave a nice flat tone. I'm using the soft pastel blending tool to try and get rid of most of the texture here, but as you can see, using the willow, it does destroy the drawing a little bit. So if that's something you're not comfortable with, do use the pencil and gently glaze in, meaning give everything a light layer of pencil. After I've got my shadows in, I can just pop some of the lines back in to get my structure back before moving on to the next phase of the drawing. Now a little bit about the forehead and the side planes of the face. If we're looking at the top outer corners of his brows, we can see there's a sense of them turning around towards the sides of the forehead. And this is the start of the side plane of the forehead. We can also see a little bit of a widow's peak, so a hairline that's jutting towards the center of the forehead there, and it should be in the center of the plane we've just created. And moving down, we can also see that the hairline follows the diagonal of the side plane of the forehead down towards the front of the ear. From just in front of the ear, we can start seeing the side plane of the cheekbones, going down towards the bottom of the nose and then narrowing down towards the chin. And I'm doing the same thing on the other side. And something that's a bit overlooked are these side planes, especially in pencil, which can be a bit flatter. It's really important to look at these side planes to indicate that this is not a flat face, it's a face that's turning away in space. So for this reason, I'm also using lines to indicate a slightly darker tone here to show that it's turning away from the light source and is in fact a 3D shape. Same thing with the chin. I can see the middle is lighter than the sides. This is because the sides are the side planes of the chin as well as the bottom of the chin. So I'm trying to gently map these out. And I try to ignore the beard at this point in the drawing, looking for the planes instead. Later I will draw in the beard on top. Now before I continue, I just want to give the drawing a bit of a cleanup. So while I'm doing this, if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. Alright, so coming back to the side planes, I can also see a side plane around the bottom of the bottom lip, turning towards the top of the chin. Now I normally work in charcoal. In most of my videos I would be working in charcoal, but something that pencil does really well is force you to make decisions. Because we're working with such a precise medium, and hopefully your pencil is sharp, it forces you to make decisions as to where the plane starts, and that's really useful for portraiture. And so we can start to see how planes connect different shapes. For instance, looking at the bottom of the nose, we can see the philtrum, which is the two diagonal lines going to the top of the lips. And we can see that connecting in a sort of heart shape to the top of the top lip. From there we can see that the lip itself slopes down towards the corners of the mouth. Often we tend to flatten these out, but by curving the corners of the mouth up just a little bit, we give the portrait a bit of an illusion of a smile. Now for the stubble, I try to again glaze over a very light tone, and this tone should be a bit lighter than how dark my side plane should be, because we're trying to show off that this is still the front plane, but just has a bit of hair on top. I try not to draw in every single hair when I draw the moustache or a beard or something like that, because it gives too much detail to an area in a drawing that I don't really want to draw the attention to. So while I might roughen up the shape a bit to indicate hair, I try not to draw individual hairs. Now continuing to add side planes to each area, I'm adding a little bit of a side plane to the sides of the bridge of the nose as well. Again, trying to keep it quite light because I don't want the nose to stand out too much in the drawing. If you have trouble seeing these halftones and side planes, try squinting at the picture. And just a little bit of squinting can help darken some of these tones and help you see the shape of them. Now in pencil, because pencil is such a line-focused medium, it can be very tempting to start to put in stuff like the nostrils and small construction lines in there. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but try to join up your shadows together. For instance, right now in the nose, I'm blending them together, and by doing this, the nose immediately starts feeling more 3D rather than having lots of lines there. Now when drawing the eye, I'm actually drawing the side plane surrounding the eye. So for instance, looking at the brow, I can see it's deeper and darker where it's near the bridge of the nose going towards the top of the brow. You can think of the eyeball as coming out in the middle and then tucking back in towards the corner. So following the line of the eyeball, we can see the top lid is slowly sloping downwards before tucking back into the eye socket. I'm using another dark shape for this. Finally, I can add another circle for both the eyeball and the iris and shade this all in. Now just like I said on the nose, it can be quite tempting to use a little lines here but I find actually joining up the darks together and glazing them all in using the same tone creates a more realistic effect than actually drawing in all the lines. Don't forget that the lower half of the eyeball is turning under as well, and so needs a little bit of a half tone or a bit of shading there as well to indicate that the eyeball is going round and tucks in underneath where we see the cheekbone. Now with one eye in, the hard part is always to then draw and copy it over to the other side. So I'm trying to keep my angles consistent and find all my measurements first. So again, first finding the deeper half tone or shadow near the brow. When drawing the iris, I try to line this up with the other eye. Again, making sure I align the top lid with the other side as well. And finally, not forgetting the outer corner and the way it tucks in to the side plane, and finally shading it all together. So at this stage, hopefully we'll be at a place where you're pretty happy with the likeness and the construction of the face. And now what we can start doing is adding small shapes, details where we want them, and most importantly, softening. And what I mean by softening is making the transition from the pencil into the paper a bit less harsh. So pencil, again, it's a very linear tool, and so when we draw, everything starts feeling quite slick and maybe a bit harsh. So I spent some time just trying to soften this. And a really useful way to soften with line is to add lines that go across the form. And what I mean by this is that, for instance, if we're looking at the cheekbones, there's lines that go along the form, following the shape of the cheekbones. Now I want to get rid of those lines and instead draw some horizontal lines that cross over that form. And this hatching technique has the feeling of making the shape a bit softer and a little bit more random, a little bit less perfect in terms of the slickness of the shape. Basically, where anything turns round, we want to make it a little bit softer by adding these horizontal lines. The same thing, for instance, for the tip of the nose. At this stage, I also like to darken the areas where I want the focus to be, so in this case the features. So in addition to softening these shapes by hashing across them, I can also darken these shapes at the same time, and this will give more focus to that area after drawing. As you can see, I'm using my Pen Pastel blender to gently blend into the darks. This makes them a bit darker and also joins them up together more. This paradoxically actually enhances the focus. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes doing this, softening and jumping around the drawing. And meanwhile, while I do this, feel free to ask me any questions you like in the comments if you're watching this live. Now coming back to the eyes are of course a very important part of the portrait, and so I want to spend a bit more time on them, enhancing the detail. Now first thing is to look at the way that the forehead connects with the eyes. So we can see where the outer corner turns round into the side planes of the forehead, and just above the brow there's quite a bit of muscle there, which allows us to make expressions with our brows. And the way that these sit and are shaped are particular to someone's likeness and also influence the way we can soften the forehead into the side plane. Now these details surrounding the eyes are quite important, but I also tend to keep them quite light, again to make the eyes give the focus of the drawing and the rest to be a little bit of a secondary focal point. So I'm going to spend some time fine-tuning my shapes in the eyes and also darkening them, giving them a little bit more tone and a bit more contrast. But even in the eyes themselves, there's lots of opportunity to soften some shapes by hatching across these shapes. For instance, around the brow, indicating some hairlines, for instance, or the turn of the eyeball. Now coming back to the muscle above the brow, where this muscle sits and sticks out, we have the arch of the brow. And just above it, we can see that the forehead feels a bit softer. So again, I'm going in with my horizontal lines going across the form in order to soften this out. Now when cross-hatching, I try to put the most emphasis on the edge between light and shadow. This is called the core shadow or the terminator. And when I darken this very slightly, this strengthens the sense of the form turning round. And it also strengthens the shape itself, which allows me to soften even more. So for instance on the nose now, I can go across the whole of the nose to soften the bottom of the nose there. As you can see, there may be a few lines indicating the inside of the nostril or something else inside of the shadow, but this should be very subtle and have less contrast than the rest of the light versus darks. So I kind of want to emulate the viewer looking at the lights and not really concentrating on the inside of the shadows, because that's not really what we would naturally be doing if we'd be looking at someone's face. Now adding in this core shadow for the nose has made it much more 3D, so I'm going to try and do the same thing again on the eyes, which are a bit more tricky because there's a lot more shapes going on. But again, trying to darken the outside of the shadow and then soften that into the paper. So when I'm adding these softer lines and using cross-hatching, there are essentially a few different lines you can use. You can use directional lines that follow across the form, like I'm doing on the side plane here, as well as the bottom of the eye socket. You can see that I'm letting my lines follow the contours of the form. Then you've got lines that go along the form, like for instance I'm using here on the cheekbone, and they give a sort of bony, stronger appearance. So I only use this where I want to make something feel a little bit more harsh. And finally, there are the lines I've been using to soften everything, which is that flat horizontal line. You can think of this as the line that indicates softness or atmosphere. A last thing to keep in mind here is that I lift up my pencil after each stroke. So I try not to make scratchy lines. Instead, I try to make my lines as even in terms of pressure as I can. So for the last few minutes of the pose, I'm going to continue doing this, darkening areas in the focal point, softening using horizontal hash lines. In the meantime, if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. Now before I end this video, something I like to do in a portrait like this to give it some atmosphere is use this technique of horizontal lines to soften all along in the shadows in the background. And this hashing technique sort of helps unify the shadows even more and therefore makes for more of a cohesive drawing. Alright, so that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you've enjoyed this and have enjoyed doing a portrait in pencil. As always, if you'd like to show us your work, feel free to use the photograph button right here in the chat, or alternatively, use the hashtag #RawUmberLive if you use Instagram.
I hope you enjoyed the session and thank you for taking part. Don't forget to post your works onto Instagram and hashtag them with hashtag #RawUmberLive. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 PM and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 PM. The last portrait session of every month is free. Thank you and goodbye.